evening. I'm Steve Cohen, a professor at Columbia School of International Public Affairs and Vice Dean of Columbia School of Professional Studies. Welcome to the first event of in our Ideas Exchange series this summer. The Ideas Exchange is a unique program we created that grew out of our recognition that so much of what makes Columbia University special is being part of the community and joining in the lively conversations that take place between our faculty, our students, alumni, and friends. The pandemic has meant we're required to be off campus. However, our work continues, and so does the need for our community to convene, connect, and converse around the important issues that are affecting us here today. As much as we love our campus and as important as places, people are more important. In the final analysis, Columbia and all schools are communities of teachers and students. Buildings and facilities are important, but who we are is more important than where we are. That's why this summer, a number of our top faculty are both teaching and participating in these special conversations about their work, its impact, and how the pandemic is affecting and influencing all of us. Through this series, we will explore how a variety of fundamental structures, intellectual origins, and cultural roots shape value systems, social practices, institutions, and meaning in our lives and society today. For more information on all the exciting events and courses at Columbia over this summer, please visit summer.sps.columbia.edu. That's the shameless pitch. Let me continue. To initiate our series this evening, I'm pleased to introduce two of our most accomplished faculty members, Shamus Khan and Nicholas Lemann. Professor Khan is chair of the Sociology department, who together with his co-author Jennifer Hirsch wrote the landmark book, Sexual Citizens, which was published earlier this year. Since then, he's been working on the Sexual Health Initiative, which seeks to understand sexual health and sexual violence on college campuses and beyond. He's going to be interviewed tonight by Nicholas Lemann, Dean Emeritus of the Journalism School and Director of both Columbia World Projects and Columbia Global Reports. Nicholas is a frequent contributor to the New Yorker magazine and the New York Times, among other publications. In tonight's conversation, Professor Khan will share a little bit about his own intellectual journey, and together with Professor Lemann, will draw upon contemporary examples, such as our collective response to COVID-19, to convey what he finds vital and inspiring about using a sociological lens to examine and understand our world. So let me turn this over to Dean Lemann, and let's begin.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome, Shamus, and welcome to all of you whom I cannot see. I want to start, let's start at the beginning. So when Shamus, I should say that Shamus and I have met before this evening, which I'll make some references to throughout this session. So when you were a little boy, your parents said to you, please make us proud and become a sociologist, right?
No, not at all. I mean, it's funny, when I was a little boy and my parents asked me what I wanted to do, I told them I wanted to be a toll booth collector because I thought you sat there all day and people just handed you money. And I wondered, like, why are all these schmucks working for a living? I could just set up a toll booth. You know, my parents are both immigrants. So my mother's from Ireland. She moved here just after she finished college. She was the first in her family to go to college. My father was the same and moved here from Pakistan. And, you know, my dad really didn't want to be a doctor, or he did kind of want to be a doctor, but he really wanted to be a mathematician and a physicist. And it's interesting because a lot of people who have parents from the subcontinent sort of have a lot of pressure to be physicians or engineers or something like that. And I think my dad was just really proud that he'd come to the United States and his kids could do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to make the sets of decisions that he made to try and get out of Pakistan. And so, you know, my brother is a political scientist. He runs the kind of largest race equality think tank in the UK, and I became a sociologist.
Yeah, I should say I have a lot of students from the subcontinent, and they'll often say things like, you haven't really suffered until you've been a 30-year-old single woman from the subcontinent who wants to go into journalism, and you have to face your parents. But I'm glad your parents were more tolerant than the parents of a lot of my students. So out of all the things to do in the world, why sociology?
So I think what most drew me to sociology was its messiness. Economics has a kind of clarity to it, which I really admire. But it's a heuristic. It's a way of looking at the world, and you use that to try and understand everything from that perspective. So you can understand not just markets, but families and the ways in which nations interact, et cetera. But it's a really useful framework that everybody consistently applies. Sociology is sort of a mess. I mean, it draws upon a wide range of disciplines. It thinks in terms of political phenomenon, cultural phenomenon, demographic phenomenon, economic phenomenon. And I kind of liked that about it. It feels like a hodgepodge of different areas. No other way of thinking about this is I felt like I could do whatever I wanted and call it sociology. And that really appealed to me because even in my career, you still see this. I sort of move between topics all the time relative to what's interesting to me.
Well, let me first sort of go on a little side road and then come back to the main road based on what you said about economists. To me, as a non-sociologist, there's a big divide within sociology between the quantitative and qualitative people, you being in the latter category. The qualitative people are more like us journalists. They go out and look at things and talk to people. Is that a wrong perception on my part, or is that in fact a meaningful division within the field?
I think for some, it's a very meaningful division within the field. My qualitative work is really inspired by the quantitative work of other people. And so, the very first book I ever wrote was inspired by an economics paper. And it was inspired by a paper by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. It's this really classic econ paper that basically it uses American tax return data to show what inequalities looked like since 1918 in the US. And what that paper shows is that inequality is primarily driven by wealthy people. And for me, that was just such a profound insight. And it may not seem like that profound of an insight today, but I remember when I first read that paper, I was in graduate school. It came out in 2003, I think. I kind of went around and I said, like, look, all of inequality is being driven by the position of rich people. We spend all our time studying poor people, but they're not where the action is. Like, shouldn't we be studying the rich people? And I got a lot of pushback for it, actually, when I first started doing it. But I think, for me, as a sort of problem-driven sociologist, I'm deeply interested in combining quantitative and qualitative work. And even in the introductory remarks that Steve noted, the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation project was a combination of quantitative and qualitative work, of which I do both.
Excuse me, I should say as a aside, I intermittently teach a course in the journalism school on interviewing. And in the course, I bring in actors to play parts, and then the students have to interview them. And Shamus has in the past helped me with this. And I remember you playing a wealthy person for the students, and you did a very good job of it, I have to say. So I don't know if you were acting or whether that's real, but
it's my tribe. I mean, the early work I did was as a qualitative sociologist was sort of like an anthropologist going into elite spaces. And I actually have spent a lot of time in those spaces, not just in coming from Columbia. I went to an elite boarding school. And even though my family was sort of not kind of long-term moneyed family that would be found in that institution, among many of the students, you get to know them pretty well. And so I would be disappointed, Nick, if I couldn't have performed the role very well, given that, like, anthropologists may have their tribes if they study the Yoruba or something like that, and my tribe just happens to live on the Upper East Side.
What's the difference between a sociologist and an anthropologist, since they both are studying human societies? Why are those two different disciplines?
Sure. I mean, for a long time, they weren't different disciplines. And even in some universities today, in some smaller liberal arts colleges, for example, the departments are combined. You have departments of sociology and anthropology. And in particular, in the French tradition, so in the tradition of Emile Durkheim, the distinction between the two hasn't been that strong for very long. I think the defining feature has become method, where anthropologists primarily use a method of field research, which is a kind of ethnographic method where they go and they're deeply immersed in a place for a long period of time. And sociologists, some of us use that method, but we use lots of other methods. So we also interview people, which tends not to be a strong approach for anthropologists. We do shorter term studies. So where anthropologists sort of often spend years in their sites, we may do it for 6 months or something. And then we also do other kinds of quantitative work and sort of a huge wide range of work that has nothing to do with spending time with people. Textual analysis. So say using using computers to sort of scrape huge amounts of text and then say, like, how do we see what the patterns are within this text? And so I think the difference is that we do a little bit of what anthropology does, then we have all these other things we also tend to do. The second big division, I think, is not methodological, but anthropologists tend to be much more theoretical. And by that, I think that they put a huge emphasis on the conceptual apparatus of what it is they're doing. And in my own work, theoretical development is kind of important, but really like rich description of just what's happening out there and why that matters is super important to somebody like me.
Let me go back and then go back forward into sociology and just go back to why did you decide to become a sociologist? I know that at one point you were a very serious pianist, for example.
Violinist, yeah.
Violinist. And did you think about completely other careers? Did you think about other academic disciplines? Was there a moment?
Yeah, when I started college, I never thought I'd be a sociologist. And in fact, the first course I took in college was a sociology course, and I absolutely hated it. I thought it was the worst course I'd ever taken, and I found it totally unpleasant. And I was really interested in math and classics, but the teacher, who also happened to be my advisor, said, "Why don't you go take a course with my colleague who's very different than I am? And I think you'll really like that class." And he was right. And I think, what it was sociology provided me with a capacity to sort of understand things that I had seen before but hadn't been able to make sense of. And famous Columbia sociologist C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination. And it's kind of a classic in sociology. And he argues that sociology is the combination of personal stories and social structure, or it's a combination of biography and history. It's two ways of saying some of the same things. And elements of my biography that were really difficult for me to make sense of was why it was that when I went away to this elite boarding school, I didn't always feel at home, even though I was a very successful student. And part of the struggle for me there, part of the struggle at that institution, was the ways in which my family didn't really culturally match with the expectations of the institution. I was a pretty big nerd, a pretty big geek, and that wasn't really what the institution, as much as it claimed to be a place of academic excellence, it wasn't really what a place like that sought to produce among young people. And so I guess what sociology made me capable of doing was aligning a series of misalignments in my life, where I had a bunch of experiences that I wasn't sure how to make sense of, and it helped me do that. And it helped me do that in large part by making me realize the deep impact of what we as sociologists call social organizations and social structures.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on that and go a little more into how sociologists think, and I'll do it in the manner of, if anybody's seen, I don't know if you have the movie Wayne's World, um, and remember when they meet Alice Cooper and bow down and say, not worthy, not worthy. That's a little bit like my experience as a journalist with sociologists, because, you know, journalists, like many human beings, think naturally in what I would call narrative logic. Um, the world is moved by individuals. Individuals can be divided into good guys and bad guys, and you know, life is a sort of struggle between good and evil. Um, so when I first started, well, I remember the moment I was working on a book, and I ran across an essay called Social Structure and Enemy, which you'll know very well, written by Robert K. Merton. And I thought, this is really interesting. I've never thought about the world this way. Um, he says in the essay basically that when people share the same goals, but they don't have the means to reach the goal, or some of them don't, they engage in what other people regard as aberrant behavior, but they sort of want the same thing. So I called him up and went to see him. He lived at 450 Riverside Drive. He was a Columbia professor. I was not then. And he said, you know, kid, there's this thing called social structure that you have to learn about. And that was the beginning of an education that the world wasn't in properly seen as a fight between good guys and bad guys, or what we like to say in journalism, you know, corrupt officials and whistleblowers, that kind of thing. So what is social structure, and how are we to understand why people do the things they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche to think about this debate in sociology between structure and agency. Um, and you know that the debate is, you know, are people engines of their own lives, or are their lives determined by the conditions under which they live? And I say it's a cliche because uh, it the way that we sociologists think about this is how our own actions produce structures, and our structures reproduce our own actions. And so let me give an example of this, because I think, you know, these words like structure and agency, they're not always that useful, or they give the like the appearance of analytic precision when actually they obscure a lot of things. And this isn't just a sociological insight, but it's certainly an insight that's sort of aligned with lots of sociological insights. So, you know, one way to think about gender is that gender is something that you are, right? People have a gender. Um, Another is to think about it as something that we do. And insofar as we do it, we reproduce it. And we reproduce it in particular ways. And you know, if you think about gender as something that you do, we can walk through lots of examples of the ways in which we all do gender. Um, so, for example, when people have children, the ways in which people buy gifts for those kids, the toys that they get for them, those are actions that help reproduce an understanding of gender. It's sort of these sets of actions that help make and remake gender all the time. In this sense, their agency really matters. Like they actually do this by, say, buying boys trucks and buying girls dolls, and thinking in terms of boys and girls. And those actions are deeply, deeply meaningful. But another way that gender is done is through an organization of, say, our schooling, or the organization of day-to-day life that helps reproduce those actions and make them more legible or more sensible in all kinds of sort of profound ways. And so to think about gender as a structure, so to think about it not just as something that we do, but a set of institutions that make that doing legible, requires a little bit of a different perspective. It requires us to think, okay, what are the sets of things in a society that help reproduce gender in the way that it gets done? And, one of them, of course, would be households and the ways in which we tend to structure our households and who does different kinds of work within it. Um, you may not think about sort of schooling as a gendered phenomenon, but there are deep pressures within systems of schooling that help reproduce gendered orientations. So, the ways in which we describe different kinds of careers and the skills that have to be good at them. If we look, for example, at surgeons, overall, surgeons are disproportionately male. And we can generate a really gendered explanation of that. We can be like, well, surgery requires cutting things, and that's gross. And boys are more likely to like that, and it also requires being assertive and making really quick decisions. But like, we could generate a totally different account of surgery. Like, surgery is effectively sewing, right? I mean, it requires really fine motor skills in the hands and little kinds of sewing of different objects in ways that like saves lives, and it requires deep compassion. And so there's a sort of just so story there in the ways in which we deploy gender. We might then think about what are the sets of things that help produce gendered patterns that aren't just individual choices, that aren't just, Nick, as you've sort of said, the cruel CEO who happens to discriminate against women. That person exists, but there are lots of other reasons that make it difficult for us to have equality among surgeons relative to gender that are about how we've decided to organize how surgery happens, how we've decided to organize workplaces. And importantly, sociology helps us sort of reveal that. It helps us see, like, not that women are making rational choices not to enter surgery, but instead that there are aspects or ways in which we've organized the performance of surgery that drive women out and that pull men in.
So let me use that as a segue into your work on sexual assault with Jennifer Hirsch. So, to me, this is sort of the perfect example of the difference between how journalists think and how sociologists think. Because as you have noticed, when we journalists want to tackle that issue, we look for a really, really bad person and expose that person's misdeeds. And, one can say that's the Lord's work, that does good things. And to some extent, it brings to light as a minor theme the underlying structures. But your work, as I read it, starts with a whole different set of questions than let's find the bad guys and call them to account, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it's not that we don't think people act badly, but there are a whole bunch of other things that we think about when we're trying to explain sexual assault. And so, so much of the attention to sexual assault is on questions of adjudication, like who was right, who was wrong, what are the he said, she said moments, and how do we figure out, like, who's the protagonist and antagonist within this. And even within journalistic stories, that setup leads you into all kinds of places where, if you think about the Duke story from Rolling Stone, where you end up in places where things can flip really quickly. I think we're seeing also, the ways in which the narrative arc of the Biden story is happening right now as part of this. So, Tara Reid has moved from being protagonist to maybe the antagonist, someone who was, an undersung hero, to now maybe somebody who's the exact opposite. But for us, this is like not a very helpful way to think about things. And so I'll give you an example of like what someone like me would think about when they think about sexual assault. Furniture. And like it seems totally absurd at first, right? Like, what does furniture have to do with sexual assault? Well, if you think about two young people hanging out together, they're at an event, party, bar, something like that, and they end up saying, like, let's get out of here. And they go back to one of their rooms. Um, in that room, in a college environment, there are typically four pieces of furniture. a desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. And if the two of them are going to sit together, they're going to sit on a bed. Right? It's awkward not to do that. And beds have social meaning. And so, someone like me looks at this and thinks, wow, look at the deep ways in which the built environment has facilitated certain kinds of behaviors. So let's not just think about like what it is that these people are as human beings in terms of their clear moral character, but let's instead think about aspects of the situation or the context that makes the actions that they're undertaking a little bit more understandable. Nick, we could also take the interaction that's happening right now. I mean, if we were at dinner, this would be really intolerable as an interaction because there's not a lot of give and take, and you have very generously asked me a lot of questions, and I've never reciprocated. I haven't turned it around and said, what about you, Nick? What about your work? And one way to read that is that I am a megalomaniac and you are a very polite human being. And we are in this situation because of my megalomania and your, politeness to the point of passivity. Another way of reading it is, well, we're both playing the role that we're supposed to play. We're doing the thing that we've been asked to do, which is that this is an interview and I'm the person being interviewed. So sorry, go ahead.
When I say similar things to my students when I teach this interviewing class, I'll start off and I'll say, so you go to the doctor and the doctor's wearing a white coat, right? And the doctor says, I've never laid eyes on you before, but I want you to take all your clothes off now. And so you say, of course. Why do you do that? Because it's a signifier that he's not who he really is. He's playing a role, and he's in role and you're in role. So then if you're a journalist, think about what would our uniform be if we wore a uniform, and what are all the things, the promises embedded in the uniform, like what you just said. I'm going to be able to ask you personal questions that I might not ask if we were expect you to say, doing this list. It's really useful to think about people playing these roles. I want to pivot to a couple. First thing that I struggle with in my sociological study of sociologists. On the one hand, per our previous discussion, a lot of my sociologist friends say, you as a journalist, to stop putting everything into this frame of good guys and bad guys and try to understand people in a way, like in a certain way, a botanist would understand plants. The plant grows in this direction, not because it's a good plant or a bad plant, but because the environment encourages it in some way, and you've got to find out what the encouragement is. So you're supposed to take quality out of yourself in a way, be more observant. Yet many sociologists I know, including you, passionately want to change the world and make it a better place. So how do you square this kind of anti-moralizing form of research with a desire to make change, if you have a desire to make change?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a desire to make change. And I think, part of the answer is that I think that change comes through understanding, not through judgment. And that empathetic understanding, that trying to have a deep understanding of why people are doing what they're doing helps you transform that behavior in a way that standing in judgment doesn't. And I think we can return to the sexual assault case here. It's not that I don't think that there are sociopaths out there and that they require addressing. I certainly actually think that that's the case. I just think that they're probably a small portion of the people who are committing assaults overall. And I think that the fantasy that we're going to punish our way out of a problem, or that we can just yell at people, be like, just act better, and that they're going to act better, is really naive. Like, We know that this didn't work with obesity. And it's like still not working. It never worked with smoking. It's not working with drinking. Like what's required is actually a multi-sectoral approach. Now, what I mean by a multi-sectoral approach is like, think about driving. How is it that young people learn to safely move 2-ton vehicles through the world without killing other people? Well, we don't do what we do for sex ed, which is to say, all you got to know is to stop at a stop sign, right? Like, just learn how to stop at a stop sign and we're good to go. And make sure you like look out for stop signs. That is like not at all the what we do. We do lots of things. We sort of think about, okay, how's the car designed? And how safe is the car? Are there seatbelts? And we're going to require people to wear them. Yes, we are. We'll create some moral pressure. And then maybe we should have curb cuts to protect pedestrians. And if there are trees that are in the way of vision, maybe we should cut those down. And maybe we should have entire training programs for people before they can ever get into a car. The idea is like, you don't teach someone to drive by saying like, don't hit anybody with your car. Right? That is not actually an effective way of doing it. But for so many of our other social problems, we have this like kind of unidimensional understanding that like if we just berated people enough to act better, they'd actually act better. And so from my perspective, like understanding, and in particular empathetic understanding, is super important. So if we take the COVID example, there's this huge amount of like what I would sort of describe as like outrage pornography of people in large groups right now in the United States. And the approach is like, we need to berate those people into acting better, and we need to stand in judgment of them. And my perspective as a sociologist is totally different. It's like, am I pissed off that that's happening? Yes, I am. But do I think that screaming at young people, act better, is going to actually get them to do anything differently? No. What I think is that I need an empathetic understanding. I need to, like, in some ways, come to an understanding of why they're acting the way that they're acting, which is partially like, it's not a personality trait. It's like, what is the context they're in? What are the networks? What are their ties to other people that are driving them to act in particular ways? Why does this make sense to them? Why do they think this way? And if I can get at that, I can get a lot closer to a social intervention that may actually be successful in transforming behavior.
Let me just stay with the coronavirus crisis for a minute and go back to something that was a much earlier theme in the conversation, which is inequality. It's been going up pretty relentlessly for about 40 years. It looks to me like this crisis is going to make it worse, not better. Is that, am I being too alarmist?
No, I don't think you are being too alarmist. No, I think, I'll pause just and say, social scientists have a pretty bad track record of prediction. So even if we're pretty good at analysis, our track record of prediction is not great. And I try not to do too much prediction, but I still, give into the impulse all the time. So, I think that there are profound things that are happening right now relative to COVID that are tied to a range of political decisions that we're making, but also tied to, the experiences of marginal communities. And so, the way in which I think about COVID is not that it's, the great equalizer. It's actually the great amplifier. So it's not actually, we're not all in this together. I, live in Harlem, not far from Columbia University, in a lovely apartment where I can order food to be delivered to me. And meanwhile, somebody has to deliver that food. And I'm putting them at risk in part by keeping myself in safe conditions. And there are ways that this happens on a tremendous scale, because for that person to even be able to do that task, they may have to get on the subway, et cetera, et cetera. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is the degree to which COVID is both reflecting and amplifying existing patterns of inequality. the absurd relationship right now between the stock market and the employment rate, is something that's fairly astonishing. And even if we look at, and this is getting into the weeds and maybe stepping into the econ realm a little bit too much, but the range of social policies that sought to not keep people in jobs, but to pay them outside of employment, social policies right now, like from the Federal Reserve, that's trying to drive people into the stock market versus into bonds, which is making people like Jeff Bezos way wealthier. I mean, like way, 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 way wealthier because of the rather absurd condition where 40 million Americans by tomorrow will have lost their jobs, and over a year, and I mean the long year, the stock market's probably lost around 6% of its value, more since January. But like, this is something that is just a tremendous amplification of existing patterns of inequality.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just very aware that, at least speaking for you and me, not necessarily all the people watching this, we have salaried jobs. We have TIAA CREF accounts that have been performing, as you just said, and we have totally transportable work that can pretty much be done on Zoom. And our biggest problem is feeling a little cut off from the world and frustrated. That's that's not the real world.
No, and I think if one of the things that we should think about when looking at inequality is how, when looking at those patterns of inequality, it's not that productivity hasn't been increasing. Productivity has actually been going up in non-trivial ways across the United States. It's that the rewards to productivity are pretty much gone. There's a small group of us in the United States who are seizing huge portions of the rewards. And this is thought of like as winner-take-all markets. And we see this sort of across the board. We see this even in our own fields of academia. I mean, the difference in the wages of somebody like me, who is a full professor, tenured Ivy League professor, and an adjunct faculty member is massive. I mean, just absolutely massive. And we have the same exact qualifications. And so, I think that the question will be, what are the sets of things that those in the most advantaged positions are either willing to or forced to give up in order to weather a kind of new world on the other end of this? And if there's an unwillingness to do that, I'm actually, concerned that like the consequence of this is really going to be, a huge amplification of inequality on the level of like something that's almost unimaginable. The death toll of COVID is not just the number of people who are going to die of COVID. It's going to be all the people who are put under huge amounts of stress with loss of work, loss of healthcare, et cetera, that will likely result in early mortality for millions of people. And so, the ways in which we respond to this and have been in some ways willing to let tens of millions of people sort of languish is going to have massive long-term impacts on death rates, on early mortality, on, even on people who are being born in this moment, their fetal conditions under which they're growing up as fetuses is putting them at risk for all kinds of negative health impacts. And that is like disproportionately happening among the most marginal members of our society.
I want to go to audience questions, and here's the first one, which is related to what we were talking about. This is about what we hear is a surge in domestic violence that's been taking place while everybody's in lockdown. How should we understand that, and what could be done about it?
Yeah, that is an incredible question. It's a really good one. I've just started a conversation with a literature professor at another university who's looking at this in Brazil and trying to think about because there, some of the estimates are that there's been sort of a 50% rise in domestic violence. And so the question becomes like, well, why is that happening, and what can be done about it? And you know, I am not a scholar of violence, and so I know I do work on sexual assault. It's a very particular kind of it. I don't actually do work primarily on domestic violence, and so I'll just, as a caveat to the person who's asked this question, you know, give them a sense that like maybe my answer is not as expert as other people's answers might be. But I think that there's a range of explanations for why this could be happening. You know, the first is stress, and the degree to which economic and also social stressors can, in particular, lead to rises in violence. The relationship there is not as strong as some of us think, but it's still there to a non-trivial degree. And the second thing is to think about, actually, to use our old analogy of space and who has control over domestic spaces and the ways in which that gets worked out. And then the third is to just think like, what is happening here? Domestic violence is in some ways a neutered term for what is vastly disproportionate male violence. So domestic violence is not actually just violence in the home, it's violence that men are committing in the home. And the sort of the degendering of that term requires some degree of challenging. There's a set of interesting findings about the ways in which experiences of emasculation can lead men to support all kinds of things and to engage in actions that can be particularly harmful. And so one of the questions is, what can we do relative to moderating a series of experiences of emasculation within the home? And that can either be because men in the home don't actually have a lot of power in their own homes, which is maybe counterintuitive, but somewhat likely. To men outside of the home have lost a huge amount of the support that they previously had. And the first thing I would think of is like pointing to the deep impact of potentially peer effects on people. And so here, one insight of sociology is that we might be able to think about the ways in which behaviors are contagious. And what that means is that we don't just have like epidemics of biological phenomena, we have epidemics of behavioral phenomena. And that those epidemics of behavioral phenomenon are transferred through networks. They actually get transferred from person to person to person. Now you may wonder, like, how is it possible that there could be a transferal of behavior from one person to another in a case where people are socially isolated? But just like think of where we are right now. Like, we're interacting, and we're not virtually interacting, we're actually interacting. You are seeing me. And so I think one of the ways to think about this is like, what are the positive sets of behaviors that we could imagine mobilizing that might help spread through networks of male-to-male peers? And this means a bunch of things, but I think the evaluation that I would say, and I'm sorry I'm giving such a long answer to this, but like there are three ways to think about like addressing bad behavior: speed, certainty, and severity. Severity tends to be our go-to, which is like if something bad happens, we act really severely to it. But it happens to be also one of the least effective ways of addressing behavior. Speed and certainty are actually much more effective. And so for me, the question would be, what are the ways in which we can institute quick and fairly regular responses to poor behavior that may lead people to act in better ways? And I think leveraging peer influence through networks is one of the ways in which we could creatively imagine that happening.
I'm going to move to the next question from the audience, and that is, we've had not just in the US, but globally, a surge in sort of right-wing populism, authoritarianism, a kind of weird association between elements of the economic elite and religious fundamentalism. This is happening in country after country, not excluding our own. Why is this happening? What's driving it?
Yeah, that's a it's a super fascinating question. It's a hard question. Actually, Nick, I think you would be good at answering this as well. So maybe I'll take a stab, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think. So some of this actually, I would relate this back to experiences also of masculinity. It may seem surprising to think about that, but it's important to know that these things aren't necessarily universal. It's particular sets of people who are more likely to embrace this, and that tends to be men. And when we talk about the increasing levels of inequality, we talk about that in a really general term that masks an important set of phenomena relative to that inequality, which is that wages overall for the average worker has remained relatively flat in the United States since the mid 70s. But that masks an important gender dynamic, which is that women's wages have increased in non-trivial ways over that period in time, and men's wages have actually declined. And there used to be this idea, it comes from a sociologist, Andrew Sherlin, who writes about the family wage, and that men's wages for a very long time were actually hyperinflated because men were understood not just to make money for themselves, but actually to make money for an entire family. And the idea of a family wage has largely evaporated. But one of the things I'm pointing to here is that the experience of men, and in the United States, white men in particular, has been one of a non-trivial loss of political, social, cultural, and economic power. And you guys may think like, no, white men are still dominant. Look at who the presidential candidates are. Look at who CEOs are, et cetera, et cetera. And I will say, you're absolutely right. But in a broad base, men's relative wages compared to all other kinds of groups over the last 40 years has declined in non-trivial ways. Their overall control over the cultural apparatus has gone from being like 99.5% to about 75%. And I think like here of like this, beware the wounded lion, beware the way in which a former really dominant political actor has experienced a relative decline and is able to identify some people that are responsible for that. So who are the people who are responsible for the decline? Well, Black Americans who used to be in much worse social conditions, who are hardly in great social conditions now, but it's way better than it was in the 1960s. Women who, again, are in not great, they're not in dominant social positions, but it sure as heck is better than it was long ago. Gays and lesbians used to be an incredibly marginal group in the United States. All of these groups have seen relative increases in their status, and white men have experienced non-trivial status declines. And so as societies have opened up to all kinds of groups that they've been close to before, there has been a palpable decline in the political power of the formerly dominant group. And there is a huge backlash against that. And we're seeing that, I think, in really pronounced ways in the United States. I don't know if you'd agree, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I would just harken back to something you said earlier, which is about economists and sociologists. So the standard, at least in my adult lifetime, liberal economist way of thinking about inequality and these kinds of problems is, you solve it on the back end. You solve it by trying to drive down, using Keynesian means, drive down the unemployment rate, have a progressive tax system, et cetera. It seems to me one of the great sociological truths is people experience the life they live in society. They don't experience it as like looking at a balance sheet. And so, you can say it's important, just something you said very briefly, to sort of address people's perceived needs at the level at which they perceive them, which tends to be, for instance, employment, unemployment, security of employment. So in the 80s and 90s, which you're too young to remember, but I do, in elite liberal circles, if you had any suspicion of free trade, you were regarded as a kind of nut job, you know, because free trade is good for everybody. And you'd see this tremendous amount of resentment in blue collar communities against free trade. And now it's finally become politically respectable. But that's an example that, you know, it doesn't matter as much what your aggregate economic condition is as what the life you live is like. And if,
Mm-hmm.
you know, your dignity of work and your place of work has been taken away, it means something. I want to switch. We're getting close to the end here. There's a couple questions about social media. So I'm curious kind of what you and your fellow sociologists think about this. One feature of social media is it's an open platform. So you can say things that are true and you can say things that are untrue. You can say things that are positive and wonderful, and you can say things that are hateful. Anybody can say anything, and anybody can receive anything. Um, it may change the way people orient themselves, their what you all would call reference group. I'm just would like to hear you reflect on, is the rise of social media a really big change in the sociology of our society?
I think so. I think you know, it has had non-trivial impacts, and that, you know, like the when I say non-trivial impacts, it may make you think like, well, that's not a very ringing endorsement of a thing, but you know, nothing matters that much, and everything kind of matters. So that's sort of like the approach of a sociologist is like, you know, if you can move something by like 5%, that's huge. Like it's not that likely that you can sort of move societies in massive ways. I think that the you know it's super interesting how uh, the anxiety of some older people, like you know you and me, Nick, maybe even relative to social media versus the ways in which people actually use it. So I'll give just a quick example that draws on some of my own work and you know work of other people about hookup apps or apps that people use to meet potential sexual partners. And there's a non-trivial amount of anxiety about those things, about the ways in which people use those things. And let me like say facts first. Young people are not having sex at earlier ages than they did 20, 30 years ago. Second, young people are actually having less sex than people did 20 years ago. So there's not more sex happening. And if you think about this entire thing that's like massively facilitating the capacity to find a willing sexual partner, it's not leading to increases in sexual activity. And so, you know, I think you have to think about like how it is that people actually use the thing and experiencing it. And here, I think that there's an enormous amount of really interesting work. A scholar at Stanford, Forrest Stewart, is doing stuff about the sort of interaction between online and offline engagement and how the ways in which people are actually using these things are radically different than the sort of fantasy of it. So, you know, for me, you know, the question would be, is social media producing the polarization that we see and the silos, or is it reflecting the polarization and the silos that already existed, and it's actually making them much more visible? And I would kind of be a little bit in the latter camp, that political polarization has been going on for quite some time before the advent of social media, and that the divides in the country in becoming increasingly political polarized places happened way before Twitter, right? That trend started much earlier. And so I think like you know, social media needs to be thought of not as a virtual place but a real place. It needs to be thought of not as a simulation of interaction but an actual interaction. And we need to think seriously, not in like wring our hands about how you know it's doing X or Y and the way that hookup apps are supposedly doing that, but actually take this sociological approach of empathetic understanding. in order to try and make sense of what's happening in those places.
There's this sort of notorious article by a journalistic colleague of mine, who's a wonderful person, called Tinder Apocalypse, in which she said that the development of Tinder is the most important change in human civilization since the development of agriculture. So, but I want to just call attention of our audience for the non-sociologists in the room to what just happened here in terms of laying out how sociologists think. So almost without noticing it, maybe, Shamus is trained to say, if everybody thinks X, then I'm not going to accept that as the gospel truth just because everybody thinks it. Instead, I'm going to treat it as a hypothesis. I'm going to try to test it with data. I'm going to examine my own assumptions that I'm bringing to this and ask myself the tough question, what are they really? And maybe they're wrong. I'm going to offer an alternative hypothesis and test that. That's, it is not how people naturally think, in my experience. It has to be learned, but once you learn it, which you have deeply and I have shallowly through knowing people like you, it just changes. It makes the world look completely different, because you're not accepting what's being handed to you.
No, I mean, I think it's it's a very, very simple thing, which is to, like, how do you think with a scientific method? And the scientific method advances in the following way. You don't seek to prove yourself right, you seek to prove yourself wrong. So if I thought to myself, my hypothesis is that everybody at Columbia is a man, and Nick and Shamus are both at Columbia, and so Columbia must be all men. I have evidence of that, therefore it's true. I would be making a massive, massive error, because as it turns out, the majority of students in the broad Columbia system, Columbia and Barnard, of undergraduates, are majority women. And so instead, what you ask is, how might I be wrong? How might I be wrong? And then you go look for evidence of where you're wrong. And you write in ways that do this. So, you basically say, okay, where am I wrong? What are the limits to my argument? And if you can't find evidence that you're wrong, you're not right. You just say to yourself, I might be right about this. I might actually have a leg to stand on here. And so what you constantly seek is not affirmation of your idea, but instead, as we call it, negation. You seek to negate what you think, to negate what you think, to negate what you think. And if the idea still holds up after you've worked as hard as you can to try and negate it, you say to yourself, there might be something there. And importantly, when you write, you then write in a similar way. You sort of present the argument, but then you say, actually, there are limits to this. Here's where I'm wrong about this. It doesn't extend to all cases. You often negate what it is you've said in previous instances to let people know the kind of bumper rails or parameters of your understanding. And to me, it's an enormously frustrating enterprise, because as it turns out, you discover that you're mostly wrong most of the time. But it's also a deeply satisfying one, because instead of asking yourself constantly, like, what's my take on this? You ask yourself, what's right? Like, what's actually most likely to be true? And how can I come to that and actually have not my understanding, but an understanding?
Yes. Well, to me, that's really inspiring, and I hope it is to our audience. It's 8 o'clock now, so we have to wind up. But thank you very, very much for doing this. And as we leave, I want to say there's a similar event tomorrow night with another celebrated Columbia professor, Brian Greene, a physicist, but a very public-facing physicist, who runs the World Science Festival and writes best-selling books and so on. And he's going to be in conversation with an author, Faith Saley. And that's also at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. So please tune in then. And thanks for being with us. And Shamus, thanks to you especially for taking time to do this tonight. It's been fascinating.
It's been wonderful, Nick. I always love our conversations. And thanks to everybody at SPS for the huge back end of people who pulled this together and made it possible. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.